Every June,
Looks like
in the
we're all
lake country
here.
of the Adirondacks and the
Thanks for
wooded
the lift,
hills of
gentlemen.
Maine and New England, families
Welcome to
said
camp,
goodbye
son.
to their children
Thanks.
for the summer.
The others are
For
over
6
there.
or 8 weeks,
Get
a
settled in.
child would live at a camp built around a lake, a scatter of wooden cabins set back under the pines, a dining hall whose bell ran the shape of the day, a waterfront with a plank dock reaching into cold, clear water. Parents sent their children north for reasons that felt, at the time, almost civic. Fresh air away from the city heat, regular activity, the discipline of a schedule shared with other children, and a particular kind of growing up that accounts from the era describe as happening only away from home. The first night away from home did not resemble anything most children had experienced before. A counselor, often only a few years older than her campers, showed each new arrival to an unfamiliar bunk in a cabin that still smelled of raw wood and pine sap. 8 children, strangers to one another that morning, unpacked trunks by flashlight and lay down under a wool blanket to a chorus of unfamiliar sounds, wind moving through the pines, a loon calling somewhere out on the dark water, the low voices of counselors still awake on the porch. Homesickness arrived on schedule for nearly every camper, somewhere around that first night, once the noise of arrival day had gone quiet and there was nothing left to distract from how far from home this all was. By the second or third morning, most children had found their footing. The bell rang, the flag went up the pole, and the day organized itself around activities that made sense once you learned them. The camp season, once it found its rhythm, ran on one quiet assumption, that the outdoors would always be available. It was an assumption the region's weather never fully agreed to honor. The days that followed arrival settled into a rhythm every camper in this region would have recognized. Morning swimming instruction at the waterfront, the lake still cool enough to sting, an afternoon given over to games on the athletic field, or a hike along a trail the older counselors seemed to know by memory. Evenings that ended, some nights, around a fire, the whole cabin group sitting close in the dark with the lake behind them, invisible except for a faint gleam where the moon caught it. Camp life, in this fair weather version, had a kind of order that children absorbed without being told its rules directly. You learned which counselor ran the waterfront and which one ran crafts. You learned the smell of the dining hall before a meal, the particular creak of your own cabin's screen door, the position of your bunk relative to the window. A camper's whole sense of belonging in those first sunny days was built on activities that required clear skies and a usable lake. Swimming tests, canoe instruction, the outdoor games that filled the long afternoons between meals. Nobody built a program around what would happen if the sky did not cooperate. Camps in wet summer country understood, in a general way, that rain was part of a New England or Adirondack summer, but the daily schedule, printed and posted on the dining hall board each morning, assumed sunshine as a kind of default condition. Then, on a morning like any other, a camper woke to a sound different from the usual dawn quiet. Rain, steady on the cabin roof, and no sign in the gray light outside that it intended to stop by breakfast. Rain at camp did not arrive with notice. There was no warning bell, no advance mention at the previous night's campfire. The morning bell rang at its usual hour, and children went to the cabin window the way they always did, expecting the lake and the pines and the ordinary gray-blue light of a mountain dawn. What they saw instead was a sky the color of wet slate, the lake surface broken into 1,000 small circles by falling rain, the dirt path to the dining hall already turning to mud under the first campers to cross it. By the time cabins reached breakfast, the day's real news was posted on the dining hall program board. Waterfront canceled, athletic field closed, a revised schedule of indoor activity written in over the usual list of swimming and games. For the counselor standing at the head of a cabin group, this was the first real judgment of the day. Not what activity came next, but what to do with 8 children, a single wooden building, and hours that the outdoor program was no longer available to fill. Accounts from the era described this moment, repeated at camp after camp across the wet summer regions, as a kind of quiet test. Some counselors had faced it before and reached instinctively for a plan. Others were newer, and the uncertainty in the cabin that first rainy morning was as much theirs as the children's. Either way, the day ahead would be organized by invention rather than by the printed schedule most campers had come to trust. And it would last, this time, not for one gray afternoon, but for most of a week. A camp built for summer sunlight was not built to absorb several consecutive days of rain, and the physical plant showed it quickly. Wooden cabin floors held a damp that no amount of sweeping could remove. Screen doors, meant to let in pine-scented summer air, now let in the smell of wet earth and standing water instead. Waterfront staff had already pulled the canoes and rowboats from the lake and turned them over on the racks, coiled the dock lines, and carried the swimming equipment up to dry storage. The lake itself now sat empty and gray, rain stitching its surface with no one there to use it. The athletic field, the center of so many fair weather afternoons, had become something closer to a shallow pond, grass flattened under standing water, unusable for anything but wading. With the two largest outdoor spaces closed to the camp community at once, the dining hall took on a role it never played on sunny days. It became the place where the whole camp actually lived, not just where it ate. Tables that emptied out within 20 minutes after a normal breakfast now held children for hours at a stretch, playing cards, reading, talking, waiting out a sky that showed no real sign of clearing. Former campers, describing these stretches decades later, return again and again to one detail before any other: the smell. Wet wood, wool blankets, damp themselves, pulled tight against the chill that crept into a cabin never insulated against sustained rain. And underneath both, the specific, inescapable smell of 30 children and a week of sustained dampness, sharing a small wooden building. A smell that, according to camp alumni accounts collected from across this region, is remembered more vividly and more fondly than almost anything from a sunny week. The rainy camp day asked something of a counselor that the sunny schedule never required: a working knowledge of indoor program that extended well past whistleblowing at the waterfront or refereeing a game on the field. At camps with experienced staff, this knowledge already existed. A trunk in the corner of the cabin held a deck of cards, a few board games with corners worn soft from years of use, paper and pencils, whatever craft materials the camp had thought to store against exactly this kind of week. The counselor, who had seen rainy weeks before, reached for these resources with something close to calm, and that calm moved through a cabin faster than any announcement could. At camps where the daily program simply assumed fair weather, the difference was obvious within an hour. Newer counselors improvised more visibly, working out on the spot what 8 restless children could do with a wooden room and no outdoor option. Either kind of camp produced the same underlying shift, whatever the counselor's experience. Children whose entire camp identity had organized itself around waterfront performance, athletic standing, or outdoor skill now found those structures simply unavailable, with nothing automatic to replace them. What filled the space instead was something closer to invention than program: card games that stretched past their usual short rounds into hours-long tournaments. Storytelling that filled an afternoon because there was, for once, nowhere else to be, and nothing else scheduled to interrupt it. Cabin projects, a craft undertaken not in the usual 40-minute period, but across a whole rainy day, built and returned to and built again. Conversations that ran longer than the normal business of camp ever allowed, simply because time, for the first time all summer, had stopped being organized in advance. By the second day of a rainy stretch, a camp's material culture told its own story. The deck of cards that appeared from a counselor's footlocker on day 1 was, by day 2, worn soft at the corners from constant shuffling. The board games kept in the craft cabin, checkers, an old set with a few pieces replaced by buttons or bottle caps, whatever had survived seasons of hard use, came out of storage in a steady rotation from cabin to cabin. Craft supplies that a normal week spread thin across many short activity periods were, during a rainy week, concentrated into a single, sustained project: a lanyard, a leather project, a piece of woodwork that a rainy week gave a child the uninterrupted hours to actually finish. Some cabin groups, at camps with the right kind of encouragement, produced something more ambitious: a cabin newspaper, written by hand or run off on a mimeograph machine if the camp had one, reporting on the small news of a reined-in week, who had won the checkers tournament, what the counselor had said at breakfast, which cabin claimed the longest ongoing card game. Copies circulated to other cabins, a modest publication with real circulation inside its own small world, and a product entirely of the sustained time that only a week of rain provided. Above all of it hung a particular quality of light, gray even, filtered through screens beaded with rain, falling across a wooden cabin floor and a table crowded with cards and half-finished projects. Alumni accounts describe this light almost as often as the smell of wet wood, the specific, muted brightness of a rainy afternoon in a mountain cabin, with the pines outside dripping steadily and nothing beyond the screen door but gray. Not every child experienced the rainy week the same way. For campers whose whole sense of belonging had been built at the waterfront or on the athletic field, the sudden absence of that structure was disorienting. The hierarchy they had learned to navigate, the skills that had earned them standing among their cabin mates, simply did not apply indoors. Some of these children spent a rainy week visibly unsettled, waiting for the rules they understood to come back. For other campers, the ones who had never quite found their footing in swimming tests or team games, the rainy week worked the opposite way. Accounts from former campers describe an indoor world that equalized some of the pressure the outdoor program had put on children who were not naturally athletic or confident in the water. A child who struggled at the waterfront might be the best card player in the cabin, or the one who kept a storytelling session going longest, or the one whose craft project impressed everyone. The rainy week did not erase the camp's social order. It rearranged it, briefly, and some children found room in that rearrangement they had not found anywhere else that summer. What nearly every account agrees on is this: rainy weeks produce some of the deepest cabin friendships of the whole season. 8 children confined to a small space, without the structure of scheduled activity to organize their time, fell into the kind of sustained, unstructured conversation that a normal busy day never made room for. Confidences were traded, alliances formed. Years later, asked to name a single memory that defined their summer, a surprising number of former campers reach not for a sunny afternoon at the lake, but for a particular rainy evening in a particular cabin. A conversation, a joke, a friendship that started because the rain gave it the time it needed. The letter written home during a rainy week read differently from the letter written after a sunny one. A sunny week letter tended toward a short list of activities: swimming, a hike, a game won or lost. A rainy week letter, with hours of unstructured cabin time behind it, carried more observation and more interior detail. A description of the cabin's social world, a report on an ongoing card tournament, something a counselor had said that had stuck with the child all week. Parents reading these letters sometimes received, without either side quite intending it, the most detailed account of their child's camp friendships all summer, because the child had, for once, both the time to write and the material to report. The rainy week also tested something less visible than a letter home: the camp's own institutional character. A director managing a rainy week, well-kept morale steady, without making the effort to do so obvious, found productive use for hours the printed schedule had never anticipated, and drew on a staff whose experience with exactly this situation either did or did not exist. Camps with that depth of staff experience and real indoor resources absorbed even an extended rain with something close to ease, a fact that alumni and staff accounts alike treat as a genuine mark of institutional quality. Camps without either showed their limits quickly, and everyone in the cabin knew it. None of this should be mistaken for an easy week. Wooden buildings designed for summer warmth, not sustained rain, grew cold and damp, and that damp reached into the physical comfort of both children and staff. Outdoor equipment that could not be properly dried grew mildewed. Most camps in this region had only limited covered program space, which meant large groups of children shared small rooms for days at a stretch, and the ordinary tensions that a normal day burned off through swimming and games and hiking had, during a stretch of rain, nowhere to go. A rainy week always ended the same quiet way. Not with an announcement, but with a morning, when the light through the cabin window looked different, before anyone had fully woken up to notice why. The sound on the roof had stopped sometime in the night. The lake, when campers finally reached it, lay flat and silver under a sky actually clearing, and the waterfront staff were already carrying the canoes back down to the water, checking the dock lines, preparing to reopen a stretch of shoreline that had sat idle for days. The athletic field would take longer to dry than the lake did, but even there, the standing water was visibly retreating. Camp, in its ordinary sunny form, was coming back. Something had changed, though, in the week that had just ended. Not in the schedule, which resumed exactly where it had left off, but in the cabin groups themselves, whose friendships had been reshaped by days of unstructured time in a way a normal week rarely managed. Over the decades that followed, the physical experience of a rainy week at camp gradually changed. As camp facilities improved through the 1960s and 70s, indoor recreation buildings, covered program pavilions, heated dining halls, extended rain became more comfortable and easier to manage. The insurance and liability considerations around outdoor, weather-dependent activity grew more formal during the same years, and camp directors increasingly kept something like a written rain plan on hand rather than relying purely on staff instinct. What a rainy week had been at a camp in the 1940s or 50s, a genuine organizational test, absorbed through staff resourcefulness and the accumulated culture of the community, became, at a more modern camp with a rain plan in every counselor's program binder, a calmer and more managed experience. Something was gained in that change. According to many who remember the earlier version, something was also quietly lost.